To understand why Kursk became the setting for the greatest armored campaign of the Eastern Front, the listener has to begin not with a tank, but with a shape. By the spring of 1943, the front line in western Russia bent outward around the city of Kursk, forming a huge Soviet-held bulge that pushed west into German-controlled territory. To German planners looking at maps in headquarters, that bulge seemed to offer a solution to a war that was slipping away from them. If they could strike its northern and southern shoulders at the same time, they might pinch it off, trap the Soviet armies inside, and restore some of the initiative lost after Stalingrad. Kursk stands out in armored warfare history because it shows how a simple-looking operational idea could become lethal when the enemy understood the idea, prepared for it, and turned the geography itself into a weapon.
If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
A salient is a dangerous shape for any army to hold because it sticks out into enemy lines and can be attacked from more than one direction. The Kursk salient was especially tempting because it was large, obvious, and positioned between German forces to the north and south. On a map, the German solution looked almost elegant. One armored force would drive down from the Orel area in the north, while another would push up from the Belgorod and Kharkov region in the south. If the two spearheads met east of Kursk, the Soviet troops inside the bulge could be cut off from reinforcement and supply. This was the classic dream of the double envelopment, an operation in which two attacking arms close around an enemy like a pair of pincers.
The appeal of the plan was rooted in earlier German success. During the first years of the Second World War, German armored operations had often depended on speed, concentration, and the ability to turn a breach into a collapse. Tanks did not win those campaigns alone, but panzer formations supported by motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, radio communications, and aircraft had repeatedly disorganized opponents before they could recover. To many German officers, Kursk looked like a chance to return to that familiar pattern on a manageable scale. Instead of attacking across the whole Eastern Front, they would concentrate against one visible Soviet projection. Instead of trying to conquer vast new territory, they would destroy a large enemy force and straighten the line. The shape of the salient seemed to promise clarity in a war that had become increasingly chaotic. Yet the same shape that tempted Germany also warned the Soviet Union. A bulge that looked vulnerable from the outside looked equally obvious from the inside. Soviet commanders did not need to guess whether the Germans might notice the salient. They knew it invited attack. The question was not simply where the Germans would strike, but how to make the expected attack fail. This is what gives the Kursk campaign its distinctive character. It was not a case of one side surprising the other with an unexpected armored thrust. It was a contest in which both sides understood the basic geometry, and the outcome would depend on preparation, timing, depth, and endurance. The battlefield began to form in the minds of planners long before the first German tanks moved. The terrain around Kursk did not look like an arena built for myth. It was a broad region of rolling steppe, villages, streams, fields, low ridges, and road networks that mattered enormously to armored movement. In dry weather, tanks could move cross-country, but they still depended on fuel trucks, repair teams, ammunition columns, bridges, and roads strong enough to carry heavy traffic. In wet conditions, the same country could become difficult and slow, with vehicles breaking down or bunching on usable routes. The land offered places for observation and concealment, but not enough concealment to make large concentrations invisible. A commander could imagine sweeping movement across open ground, yet every advance still had to pass through defended villages, minefields, anti-tank zones, artillery fire, and the practical limits of machines under strain. For the Germans, The Bulge suggested an operation with a clear beginning and end. Break in from both sides, drive toward each other, close the ring, and destroy what was trapped. But real armored warfare is not a drawing of arrows. An arrow on a map hides the engineers crawling forward to clear mines, the infantry pinned down short of a trench line, the artillery observers trying to find targets through dust and smoke, and the recovery crews hauling damaged vehicles out of the way. It hides the time lost when a bridge is damaged or a road becomes jammed with traffic. It hides the fact that a tank force that slows down under fire can become less like a spear and more like a target. At Kursk, the space between the arrow and the ground would become the central problem. The northern shoulder of the salient was important because it offered a route from the German-held Orel area toward Kursk from above. Here, the German attack would have to move through defenses that the Soviets had been preparing with care. The ground was not simply an empty approach to the city. It became a layered defensive region where every mile could cost time, vehicles, and men. The northern arm of the pincer needed to break through and keep moving because a double envelopment cannot succeed if one side stalls while the other continues alone. That is why the northern face of the battle would later feel so grinding and unforgiving. It was not the most glamorous part of the campaign, but it was essential to whether the German plan could work at all. The southern shoulder offered a different kind of danger. From the Belgorod and Kharkov area, German forces had more room to develop a powerful thrust, and the southern attack would eventually make deeper progress than the northern one. This mattered because the whole operation depended on movement toward a meeting point behind the Soviet front. The farther one arm advanced, the more urgent the question became. Could the other arm keep pace? And could the Soviets prevent the advancing force from gaining operational freedom? The southern face would become more fluid, more alarming, and more famous because it led toward Prokhorovka. But even there, the German advance would not be a clean race across open country. It would be a hard push through belts of resistance designed to delay and channel it. From the Soviet perspective, holding the salient was not the same thing as passively waiting inside a trap. The Red Army turned the Kursk Bulge into a defensive system in depth, meaning that the front was not defended by one thin line that would decide everything. Instead, the Soviets prepared multiple belts of trenches, minefields, anti-tank gun positions, artillery zones, and reserve areas. If the Germans broke through one belt, they would meet another. If they penetrated a sector, they could be counterattacked from the sides or halted by fresh forces deeper in the rear. This approach recognized a hard truth about German armored warfare. The first shock might be powerful, but if it could be slowed, separated, and forced to fight repeatedly, the attacker's momentum could be drained away. The city of Kursk itself was not the only thing at stake. The real prize was the destruction of forces and the recovery of initiative. For Germany, capturing territory mattered less than cutting off Soviet armies and proving that the Wehrmacht could still impose operational decisions in the east. For the Soviet Union, simply holding ground was also not enough. Soviet leaders wanted the German attack to spend itself against prepared defenses, after which Soviet armies could launch their own counteroffensives against weakened German positions. This made the Bulge both bait and fortress. It was dangerous to hold, but it could also be used to draw the German armored force into a battle whose rhythm the Soviets had already tried to shape. That is why Kursk should not be imagined as a sudden meeting of tank fleets. It was an immense combined arms struggle prepared over weeks and fought by systems as much as by crews. Tanks would be central, but so would mines that broke tracks, artillery that disrupted assembly areas, infantry that held trenches, engineers who opened or blocked routes, reconnaissance units that searched for movement, and aircraft that tried to see and strike beyond the front line. Communications mattered because commanders needed to know where a breach was real and where it was only a local gain. Logistics mattered because an armored thrust consumes fuel and ammunition at a pace that can quickly outrun planning. The Bulge at Kursk became a test of whether a modern army could coordinate violence, movement, and supply under conditions of extreme pressure. The tragedy of the German plan was that the more obvious the salient appeared, the less likely it became that the old method would work cleanly. A double envelopment depends on speed and surprise, or at least on the defender's inability to react effectively. At Kursk, the Soviets had time to prepare precisely because the German intention was so readable. The German army could still assemble elite formations, skilled commanders, and powerful armored vehicles, but it was attacking into a battlefield where the defender had studied the same map and reached the same conclusion. The geography that seemed to offer Germany an opportunity gave the Soviet Union a warning. The salient begged to be pinched off, but that meant the pincers would arrive where the defenders had been waiting for them.
In the long history of armored warfare, the Kursk salient teaches a lesson that reaches far beyond 1943. Tanks are often associated with surprise, movement, and the sudden rupture of a front, but the enemy gets a vote, and terrain can be prepared to punish predictability. At Cambrai in 1917, tanks had been used to crack a fortified system that seemed resistant to ordinary attack. By Kursk, armies had learned not only how to use tanks, but how to defend against them in depth. Later mechanized battles would continue this pattern. Armored forces remained powerful, but only when they were supported, supplied, informed, and used in conditions that allowed momentum to grow. Kursk showed that a defender who can read the attacker's design may turn even favorable-looking geography into a trap.
The bulge at Kursk was therefore more than a feature on a wartime map. It was the visible expression of a changing war. Germany saw in it the possibility of one more decisive armored operation, a chance to cut and circle and recover lost confidence. The Soviet Union saw in it the place where that ambition could be absorbed, slowed, and broken before being answered with force of its own. The drama came from the gap between headquarters simplicity and battlefield reality. On paper, the salient looked like a problem waiting for a pincer solution. On the ground, it became a dense, prepared, deadly environment where every mile demanded coordination and every delay favored the defenders. That is why the story of Kursk must begin with the bulge itself, because the shape promised decision, while the battle would reveal the cost of trying to force one.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.